There's a widespread belief that revolutions are caused by worsening economic conditions, but that's actually not true. In the decades before the outbreak of a revolution, the overall economy is paradoxically improving. Consider Tsarist Russia, for example, where the per capita industrial output rose steadily year after year, almost right up until 1917. This economic growth, which is caused by the emergence of a new economic sector or the expansion of an old one, makes certain members of the population newly rich. And because the policy needs of the rising class do not align with those of the established order, the two come into conflict. In France, for example, the influx of colonial trade increased the wealth of the country and made a class of newly rich merchants. Fearing their position would fall with the influx of cheaper English goods into French markets, they objected to the 1786 treaty liberalizing trade between France and England. But although the overall wealth of the country is increasing, the gap between rich and poor is widening. In England, the relative prosperity of the peasantry in the 16th century disappeared after the enclosures of common lands became more widespread. The first half of the 17th century was, in the words of one economic historian, quote, "probably the most terrible years through which the country has ever passed." Almost half the population required government relief to survive. Evicted peasants found their way into cities where they sought employment that did not exist. Many of them were desperate enough to emigrate, and the first real beginnings of the English colonization of America date to this period. This poverty is not the result of the absolute conditions of the country, but the exploitation of the poor by the rich for the sake of luxury consumption. In France, ruinous taxes, exorbitant ground rents, burdensome forced labor, and usurious debts drove the peasantry to desperation. A report made in 1779 to the Provincial Assembly of Bari stated that the annual value of the unpaid labor performed by the peasantry was 700,000 livres. Resources drained off from the countryside and found their way into the commodious chateaux of the notables, who took them to be spent lavishly at the courts in Paris and Versailles, where the aristocracy seems to have done nothing but attend sumptuous feasts, operas, plays, masked balls, and garden parties. Devoid of purpose and disconnected from the common lot of humanity, the ruling class shamelessly abandons itself to hedonistic diversions and amorous intrigues.
At the beginning of the king's reign, men were occupied only with increasing the list of their mistresses, and women with publicly stealing each other's lovers. The lure of pleasure, which was the basis of all this, banished any kind of languor, and the continual example of the greatest deregulations authorized the defiance of principles and restraint.
Despite, or maybe because of, this eroticism, the fertility rate in the country plummets, and a mood of antinatalism becomes widespread.
In the country where I am staying, I hear that marriage is declining and that the population is decreasing on all sides. In my parish, with a few firesides, there are more than 30 single persons, male and female, old enough to marry, and none of them having any idea of it. On being urged to marry, they all reply alike that it is not worthwhile to bring unfortunate beings like themselves into the world.
With the detachment of sexuality from reproduction, a transactional attitude toward marriage becomes commonplace, and misogyny and feminism correspondingly flourish. In England, Joseph Swetnam published The Arraignment of Lewd, Idle, Froward, and Unconstant Women in 1616, which explained that women esteem of a man without money as a horse doth of a fair stable without meat. The pamphlet was wildly popular with the common people, going through 10 printings in less than 20 years. English women condemned the work in a flurry of pamphlets and plays, claiming male abuse was the true cause of the vices about which Swetnam complained. The mutual hostility helps create a large population of unmarried young people, who in turn create new sources of political instability. In the winter of 1642, for the first time in English history, some 400-plus independent women suffering from financial hardship petitioned Parliament for a change in trade policy. When the outraged Duke of Richmond tried to disperse them, they physically attacked him and broke his staff of office. Meanwhile, attacks on religion become popular and widespread. In France, the philosophes, public intellectuals who espoused Enlightenment values and scientific theories, campaigned tirelessly against the evils of religious superstition. The frontispiece of Diderot's famous Encyclopédie reflected the mood of this period. The veiled figure at the center represents truth. To the left, reason tries to peel away her veil, and beneath him, philosophy assists in the effort. Meanwhile, theology is depicted facing away from truth, groping absently at nothing. The decline in family, religion, and civic virtue produces a fragmented public. In France, a secret memo written to King Louis XVI by the French Minister of Finance warned that the country was in the process of disintegration.
It is a society composed of several disunited orders and a people whose members have very few social ties between them. Consequently, no one is concerned with anything but their own particular interests, and almost no one bothers to fulfill their duties or to understand their relations with others.
In societies of this stamp, in which there are no fixed landmarks, every man is constantly spurred on by a desire to rise and a fear of falling. And as money, which is the chief mark by which men are classified and divided one from the other, fluctuates incessantly, passes from hand to hand, alters the rank of individuals, raises families here, lowers them there, everyone is forced to make constant and desperate efforts to acquire or retain it. Hence the ruling passions become a desire for wealth at all cost, a taste for business, a love of gain, and a liking for comfort and material pleasures.
As the race for position becomes unusually competitive, the circulation of elites grinds to a halt, particularly in the intellectual professions. Aspirants from the lower orders find their rise obstructed for reasons other than merit. Sometimes this is because there are simply more qualified people than there are positions. In England, for example, enrollments in universities exploded in the decades prior to the Civil War, a five-fold increase over the course of a century without any corresponding increase in employment opportunities. Other times, an element of prejudice or nepotism biases the selection process. In France, for example, Marat's scientific research raised interesting questions about existing theories of heat and light, but he was repeatedly denied admission into the Academy of Sciences because of the machinations of the aristocratic chemist Lavoisier. Whatever the cause, the elites fragment, and the mood of cynicism becomes widespread.
You think that because you are a great lord, you are a great genius. Nobility, wealth, rank, high position, such things make a man proud. But what did you ever do to earn them? Chose your parents carefully, that's all. Take that away, and what have you got? A very average man. Whereas I, by God, was a face in the crowd. I've had to show more skill and brain power just to stay alive than it's taken to rule all the provinces of Spain for the last 100 years. It began to dawn even on me that if you want to be rich, know-how is far more important than knowledge.
Meanwhile, a wide range of distress indicators like vagrancy, suicide, crime, and social unrest rapidly increase. In England, hundreds of riots broke out in the first half of the 17th century in response to the enclosures of common pasture lands. Vagrants were so numerous that many had to be forcibly emigrated to America as indentured servants. In the Weimar Republic, the suicide rate increased dramatically in the decades before the Nazi regime took power. In Russia, the crime rate increased almost 200% between 1860 and 1917. In the 6 months from October 1905 to April 1906 alone, there were 827 assassination attempts on government officials, which killed 288 and wounded 383. These mounting dysfunctions find no remedy in the pre-revolutionary government. The administration is invariably bloated, incompetent, and more often than not insolvent. In England, parasitic courtiers caused state expenditures to increase as revenues fell. By 1630, the state had sold off most of its assets, and interest payments on the royal debt exceeded the state's total revenue. In France, administrative positions were created and sold as a way of financing the government, creating huge numbers of useless functionaries. Weights and measures varied not only from region to region, but often from town to town. A bushel at Toulouse might have been much more than a bushel at the neighboring city of Montauban, and often even the words used to designate the measure differed by municipality. When crises arise, the state shows a conspicuous incapacity to deal with them, and public functions therefore increasingly fall back to the private initiative of charitable citizens. The 1891 famine in Russia, for example, was exacerbated by the logistical incompetence of the Tsarist regime. The export policies of the Russian government continued encouraging shipment of grain out of the country, while peasant families were starving. The public works program created to provide relief was implemented only after the famine had ended. The great novelist Leo Tolstoy had to set up relief programs with his own money after he found the government too sclerotic and stubborn to take his advice. Under normal conditions, intellectuals and prominent men typically celebrate, mythologize, and defend the established order. But in the period prior to a revolution, their allegiance transfers from the ruling class to the class ruled, and every aspect of the old regime is viciously attacked. In England, the anonymous author of the Mar Prelate pamphlets attacked the Church of England, and figures like John Milton demanded an end to the monarchical form of government. In France, the philosophe fulminated against everything superstitious, irrational, and unjust. When all of these factors are combined, the dysfunctions of the old regime subtly create a cross-class coalition to oppose it at its moment of greatest vulnerability. Now, with all the pieces in place, the decades of economic progress see a sudden reversal. In 1917, for example, Russian industrial production declined rapidly, and coal mining fell to a level that threatened the nation's transportation, leaving the economy virtually in freefall. The expectations connected to the decades of economic expansion become incompatible with the possibilities of the worsening conditions, and all of the dysfunctions and injustices of the preceding decades come into sharp and unbearable focus. The outbreak of a revolution is typically unplanned and often initially unrecognized for what it is by its participants. In France, bad harvests in 1788 and 1789 were starving the French working classes, and dozens of bloody riots broke out throughout the country. In Russia, there were bread riots all over St. Petersburg in the days before Nicholas II abdicated the throne. The rioting is initially motivated more by the immediate conditions of the country than any conscious revolutionary plan. But at crucial moments of confrontation, the state demonstrates its inability to repress the uprising by force, and the riots gradually become more intentional. In France, Louis XVI had repeatedly ignored the recommendations of his advisors to man the Bastille with loyal troops and replace Delaunay with a competent commander. He did neither, and it was overthrown with relative ease. In America, there were naval forces available to protect the tea ships in the Boston harbor, but the sabotage operation by the Sons of Liberty went on unimpeded. With the wider public made aware of the state's incapacity, the demands for change grow louder. The armed forces of the existing government begin to defect or are otherwise unwilling to discharge their orders, more often than not because the state no longer has the funds to pay them. On the day the Bastille was stormed, some French guards stationed at the prison refused to fire on the crowd, and others defected to the side of the revolutionaries. In Russia, when Nicholas II ordered the Volinsky regiment to fire on an unarmed crowd, they fired into the air instead. The next day, they joined the revolutionaries and were followed by several other regiments. At some point, it becomes clear that the official government is no longer capable of performing basic civil functions, and the opposition assembles extra legal forces to replace it. In Paris, the day before the Bastille was stormed, a large group of men assembled at the Hôtel de Ville to establish a citizen guard. 48,000 men were enrolled to watch over the city's 60 districts, each taking an oath of fidelity to the new Assembly of Citizens. Across the Atlantic in America, a provincial congress gathered in Salem to levy taxes and enroll in armed militia forces soon after the Boston Tea Party. With the emergence of a dual power structure, the country breaks up into three factions: conservatives who want to preserve existing institutions, moderates who want to reform them, and radicals who want to overthrow them. Initially, the moderate reformers are more numerous and respectable than the radicals. They are the ones who organize the new informal government to perform emergency police functions, and eventually this new informal government either takes over or abolishes the existing formal one. In France, the National Assembly, which took over government functions from the Bourbon dynasty, desired nothing more revolutionary than a constitutional monarchy. Lafayette's oath at the Fête de la Fédération in 1790 promised that the National Assembly would remain forever faithful to the nation, law, and king. In Russia, about 10 days after the outbreak of the February Revolution, the Romanov dynasty came to an end, and control of the government passed to the Duma, which was composed of avatars of the propertied classes who desired mild reforms in the style of Western liberal democracies. At this stage, the old abuses are abolished and the machinery of the government is streamlined and overhauled. A period of hopefulness settles over the country and even extends to sympathizers beyond it.
Europe at that time was thrilled with joy. France standing on the top of golden hours and human nature seeming born again.
With their combined strength, the radicals and the moderates overpower, persecute, and exile the conservative forces that oppose them. During the American Revolution, loyalists were censored, abused, and tormented by lawless mobs. After the passage of the Stamp Act, large crowds in Boston destroyed the houses of affluent loyalists, like Governor Thomas Hutchison and the administrator Andrew Oliver. In New York, publishers of Tory pamphlets had their printing presses destroyed. Obnoxious Tories were tarred and feathered and then paraded through the streets so that the whole city could see. The Provincial Congress of New York in December 1776 went so far as to order the Committee of Public Safety to secure all the pitch and tar necessary for the public use and public safety. The exiled conservatives regroup and mount a counterattack, often with sympathetic forces from abroad. In South Carolina, exiled loyalists found their way into the ranks of the British Army in regiments like General Tarleton's brutal British Legion. Other groups, such as the New Jersey Pine Robbers, organized by the illegitimate son of Benjamin Franklin, deployed guerrilla tactics against Patriot forces throughout the colonies. In France, Louis-Joseph de Bourbon, one of several members of the exiled aristocracy, formed an émigré army led by displaced nobles. Around the same time, the King of Prussia and the Holy Roman Emperor jointly issued the Declaration of Pillnitz in August of 1791, in which they affirmed their intention to defend the French monarchy and called on other European monarchs to assist them. By the time the first Committee for Public Safety was organized on April 6, 1793, France was simultaneously at war with England, Holland, Prussia, Austria, Spain, and Sardinia, and their armies were either already on French soil or were soon to invade. Meanwhile, there were large uprisings in the Vendée, and insurrections were taking place in Marseille, Lyon, and Toulon. At a council held in Antwerp on April 9, 1793, the representatives of England, Holland, Prussia, and Austria openly announced their plan for annexing regions of France, and they explicitly stated their intention to execute the entire revolutionary government. In Russia, General Kaledin, hetman of the Cossacks, demanded that the government take reactionary steps which would have undone the revolution in late August of 1917. He was supported by army officers, industrial leaders, and Duma members. Not long after, the conservative General Kornilov attempted a coup d'etat against the provisional government, and his officers announced their intention of hanging Kerensky. When the Bolsheviks assumed power, English, American, German, Japanese, and other foreign armies were in possession of various parts of the country. Diplomatic negotiations were being made by enemy governments to partition the country after the overthrow and execution of the leaders of the revolutionary government. The old Tsarist army was gone, and what remained of Kerensky's forces was totally inadequate for the defense of the country. Meanwhile, counter-revolutionary white armies led by Kolchak, Denikin, Yudenich, and Wrangel, and supplied by international sympathizers, were engaged in a four-front civil war against the new Soviet government. Lenin was almost assassinated 3 times in 1918. At this point, the crisis created by the revolution becomes a full-blown emergency, and the moderates prove themselves ill-equipped to handle it. Through a series of policy disputes, they are gradually driven into exile or put to death by the radicals in their coalition, who have been hardened in the crucible of the old regime's repression and are more prepared for drastic measures. In France, the government passed from the hands of men like Lafayette, Mirabeau, Barnave, and Condorcet to men like Marat, Saint-Just, Danton, and Robespierre. In Russia, control of the provisional government passed from men like Prince Lvov, Konovalov, and Kerensky to men like Lunacharsky, Trotsky, and Lenin. Once the radicals take power, the revolution passes into its penultimate phase. The Reign of Terror begins. The Reign of Terror is a period of explicit control through state violence and surveillance, the purpose of which is first to pacify the opposition under disadvantageous conditions and rescue the revolution from defeat, and second to try to realize the utopian ambitions implicit in the revolutionary project. In Ireland, during the Puritan Revolution, Cromwell oversaw 2 massacres during the siege of Drogheda and the sack of Wexford, with the express purpose of discouraging the Irish people from continuing the rebellion. Meanwhile, back in England, he implemented a spy system designed to give the impression of vast scale and engaged in several dozen highly publicized executions to keep the people too frightened to revolt. In France, 178 revolutionary tribunals were set up in various parts of the country. The one in Paris guillotined a little over 2,500 people, and the total number of victims throughout France was about 17,000. Most of them were either political antagonists or members of the aristocracy, but about 4,000 were peasants and 3,000 were working men. 1,200 of them were women. Although this number was large, the actual purpose of the executions was to ensure it wasn't larger. When the city of Lyon was captured, only about 1,600 people were executed, a tiny number of the city's total population. But by intentionally allowing some rebels to escape, news of the city's decimation spread throughout France and abroad. Working men were hired to give the appearance of destroying several buildings, and visitors from other cities were given a view of the mock destruction. During the critical months of the revolution, people all over France and abroad believed Lyon had been destroyed and its inhabitants slaughtered, and the other cities considering revolt immediately became quiescent. The leaders who take power during this period tend to be Machiavellian idealists, equal parts fanaticism and ruthlessness. They are generally puritanical to the point of asceticism, and so intransigently committed to their principles they will do anything to realize them, including violate their principles. In France, the incorruptible Robespierre opposed the death penalty so strongly that he resigned his position as a judge to avoid adjudicating capital cases. But a little over a year later, he demanded, without any sense of hypocrisy, that the Constituent Assembly execute Louis XVI. Revolutionary leaders see no contradiction between actual actions and professed ideals because the cause of the revolution justifies everything necessary to realize it. If there is to be liberty, equality, and brotherhood for all men in the future, anyone who is an enemy to liberty, equality, and brotherhood at present must be eliminated. And so they are.
You do not understand this, holy men. We shall explain to you. The terror of Tsarism was directed against the proletariat. The gendarmerie of Tsarism throttled the workers who were fighting for the socialist order. Our extraordinary commissions shoot landlords, capitalists, and generals who are striving to restore the capitalist order. Do you grasp this distinction? Yes?
In between the denunciations, arrests, executions, and warfare, the radicals also begin the process of transforming society. Every effort is made to break with the old regime. Monuments are toppled, things are renamed, and habits are reconstructed. The property of counter-revolutionaries is confiscated, and economic life is brought under the direct control of the government. In Russia, the landed estates of the Tsarist nobles and the factories and other property of the Russian bourgeoisie were confiscated by the Soviet. The old statues of the Tsarist regime were dismantled and removed from Moscow and other large cities. In France, property was confiscated from the Catholic Church, monarchy, and aristocracy, and the Committee for Public Safety implemented a price maximum on essential goods and punished any merchant that violated it. The French Republicans created an entirely new calendar that was devoid of royalist and religious influence, and Robespierre even created a new state religion to replace Roman Catholicism. To engender the virtues of the new regime, the revolutionary government insinuates its way into every aspect of social life, policing even minor vices and domestic relations. In England, the Puritans, whose name has since become synonymous with repressive prudishness, enacted laws against gambling and drinking, shut down theaters, prohibited sports, and even went so far as to ban the celebration of Christmas and Easter in 1647. In France, a Jacobin society in Auxerre was scandalized by a woman who inherited her late husband's 200,000 livres after her infidelity drove him to suicide.
You will remark, legislators, in the conduct of this woman, an immorality shocking to that virtue which is the basis of republican government. The story of her scorn, her indifference, her aversion, put beside the solicitude, the care, finally the despair of her husband, revolted all true republicans. And the first cry of the society, always animated by the principle that he who does not love his fellows is a blind person, that he who could hate them is a monster, was to ask the convention for a repressive law which could prevent this sort of thing from happening.
The invasiveness, paranoia, and strain of the terror gradually weakens public enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause. When the immediate threat is overcome, certain members of the revolutionary government begin to feel that the radicals are taking things too far. Fearing the charge of counter-revolutionary will be hurled against them, they hurl it against their enemies first. The terror is turned back on itself, and a reaction sets in. In the famous phrase of the French moderate Mallet du Pont, the revolution, like Saturn, devours its children. On the 9th day of the month of Thermidor, in the second year of the French Republican calendar, or July 27, 1794, Robespierre and his followers were captured by conspirators and executed by guillotine, thus ending the French Reign of Terror. Historians have typically termed the period that followed the Thermidorian reaction. Trotsky, who had extensively studied the French Revolution, extended its use in his 1936 book The Revolution Betrayed to cover the period of the Russian Revolution after the death of Lenin. Since then, Thermidor has been used as a generic term by historians and sociologists for the period of regression that typically follows the terror. At its most basic level, Thermidor means counter-revolution. The terrorism used to secure the objectives of the revolution is now turned against the revolutionaries themselves. Political exiles are allowed to return, and certain members of the old regime find their way back into the new government. The purges continue, but now in reverse. The most radical revolutionaries are blamed for the country's crisis and are exiled, imprisoned, or killed. In France, it is generally agreed that the Thermidorian reaction began in response to the Ventos decrees, which were advanced by Saint-Just and supported by Robespierre. The proposal was to confiscate the property of all enemies of the revolution and this is the objectionable part that cost Robespierre, Saint-Just, and the other Robespierrists their heads, redistribute it to the poor sans-culottes, the distressed urban artisans and manual workers who formed the spine of the revolutionary movement and who were ruthlessly persecuted after the fall of the Jacobins. The shock troops of the Thermidorians were the Jeunesse Dorée or Muscadin, a group composed primarily of the sons of wealthy families hurt by the policies of the Jacobin government, particularly the Maximum, which imposed fixed prices on all goods. They dressed in ostentatious costumes to contrast themselves with the austerity of Jacobin virtue, and gathered in a café in the Palais Royal, where they exchanged information and made plans to prowl around the streets of Paris with thick wooden clubs looking for sans-culottes to bludgeon and harass. Fights broke out everywhere in Paris during these years, in the streets and squares, in cafes, theaters, and government offices, and by means of this violence the remaining Jacobin clubs were forcibly closed. In Russia, Thermidor occurred in 1921 after the New Economic Policy, or NEP, brought a provisional form of capitalism back to the country. The discontented workers were denounced as counter-revolutionaries and were repressed by party officials and the secret police. By 1923, concentration camps were filled with tens of thousands of political prisoners, mostly Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. Thousands of peasants were deprived of voting rights, and troublesome workers were exiled to Siberia. Huge numbers of teachers, professors, students, engineers, army officers, and factory managers were screened and purged from political life. Meanwhile, political functionaries and elements of the wider public regressed to pre-revolutionary habits and vices. The austere puritanism of the radicals is replaced by unrepentant hedonism, luxury, dissoluteness, and corruption. Common vices like drinking, gambling, and prostitution flourish again, and the great hope that human nature is on the verge of rebirth gives way to weariness, cynicism, and despair. The corruptions of the old regime are now perpetrated in the name of the revolution itself. In France, during the reign of the Directory, not even the pretense of propriety was attempted. Most of the big companies made large loans to the government and its officials, which helped them to secure the government contracts on which their profits depended. The Baudin Company, to take a typical example, would lend money to Josephine de Beauharnais, the future wife of Napoleon and then mistress of Director Barras, and she would use her influence over the latter to secure favorable contracts for the company. Meanwhile, the affluent returned to riotous living. Robespierre was dead and the terror was over, and the morose austerity of Jacobin rule was quickly to be made a thing of the past. Before the smell of the dead had disappeared from the place where the guillotine had stood, a craze for festivity and dancing overtook Paris. Thousands of dance halls were opened around the city, and with a spirit of jocund irony, fashionable Parisians began dancing everywhere, even at cemeteries and places where massacres had taken place. At a special ball held for the family members of those executed by the guillotine, guillotine, attendees greeted each other a la victim, that is, with a movement that resembled the condemned person as they put their head through the guillotine's lunette. High fashion was making a comeback too, and modish women took to wearing artistically braided blonde wigs and frilly dresses in bright saturated colors. The merveilleuses, female counterparts of the jeunesse dorée, began dressing in diaphanous gauze gowns in the middle of winter, which left very little to the imagination. One could not have been more richly unclothed, quipped Talleyrand. Audouin's Journal Universel commented that, without anyone's realizing it, the vigorous style of the Republic is giving way to the syrupy style of the monarchy, and despite protests, Monsieur began to replace the Republican form of address citoyen in polite circles. Perhaps the central figure in Parisian culture at this time was a woman named Theresia Cabarrus, affectionately referred to by the Thermidorians as Our Lady of Thermidor. A quick glance at her biography gives a pretty good indication as to why.
In 1788, at the age of 15 and a half, she had married the Marquis de Fontenay, who happened to be saddled with a fortune in real estate. After her divorce in 1793, she became the mistress, in succession, of the Lameth brothers, the Duc d'Aiguillon, Félix Le Pelletier, Tallien, to whom she was married for a time, Barras and Ouvrard, and finished what might be called her career as the Princesse de Caramon-Chimay. She moved out of her rooms in the Chaussée d'Antin and went to live on Cours-la-Reine at the Chaumière, a magnificent residence built by the famous actress Mille Raucourt, which soon became a center of society life. Though she was adored in the salons, Theresia Cabarrus was vehemently detested by the lower classes, who were disgusted by her immodest attire. Everyone agreed that the origin of her wealth was more than murky. In Fructidor, year 2, at the Jacobin Club, Levasseur de la Sarthe had asked Tallien to explain his liaison with an émigré's wife who also happens to be the daughter of the treasurer of the King of Spain. On 8 niveaux, Cambon denounced her to the Assembly as a new Marie Antoinette. In a letter, the deputy Soubrani waxed indignant. She makes a display of the most shameless luxury in the midst of the most appalling poverty.
The story is basically the same in Russia. The NEP saw a revival of pre-revolutionary vices in cities like Moscow and Petrograd. Permissions to mine mineral deposits were granted to Western industrialists. Prostitution, which the Bolsheviks had sought to eliminate, resurged in urban centers. Nightclubs, cabarets, and gambling dens reappeared, catering to the party elites, who began to indulge in decadent Western jazz. An internal memo written by the Central Committee titled "On the Struggle with Excessive Luxury and Criminal Abuse of Office Prerogatives" described the widespread practice of party officials maintaining, quote, fleets of automobiles and horse-drawn carriages without any work-related need. Railcars were frequently dispatched for the sole purpose of delivering passengers to the resorts. High-ranking party officials made no distinction between personal and state expenses, and state funds were systematically embezzled for personal gain and enjoyment. The provincial officials were hardly any better. In the city of Tambov, an incident was recorded of a habitually drunk member of the Communist Party beating peasants. Another report from the same region described a police chief breaking into a peasant's house and ordering the man's wife to sleep with him. In the Vologda province, there were innumerable reports of drunkenness, hooliganism, embezzlement, and bribery. One report stated that a chairman of a local party committee had turned official premises into a place for drunken parties and amorous affairs with women. Hundreds of similar reports were recorded in provinces all over Russia. While the members of the new ruling class are busy indulging themselves in luxury and crime, the country settles deeper into an economic crisis. In France, the inflation of the revolutionary paper currency made it impossible for the poor to afford the soaring prices. A bundle of firewood that had cost 20 livres in 1790 cost 500 livres in 1795. Local officials in Toulouse could only work for a few hours during the day because they could not afford to pay the cost of lighting their offices. Fashionable visitors coming home from a late night of dancing at places like the Élysée Palace could see long lines forming at bakeries. Women and children stood all night in freezing temperatures for quarter-pound rations of black bread delivered at 7 in the morning, and there was seldom enough bread to feed everyone. On the outskirts of Paris, people fed off the carrion of war horses, and in the cities and towns, a lively trade in cat and dog meat flourished. In Marseille, infant mortality rose to 21%, and the national average was even higher. The chaos, cynicism, and lawlessness of the Thermidorian period finally culminates in the emergence of a tyrannical leader who puts an end both to the dysfunctions of the Thermidorian reaction as well as the revolution itself. Stalin, Cromwell, and Napoleon are importantly different, but they all serve the same role in relation to their respective revolutions. Even in the American Revolution, a less extreme version of the same tendency took place. There were plenty of domestic political disturbances before the Constitution was ratified in 1788. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, the dispute over paper money, quarrels about interstate tariff walls, the rise in lawlessness and crime. People turned to Washington for safety. With Madison, Hamilton, and the other Federalists, and against the opposition of radicals like Patrick Henry, he urged the formation of a strong national government, which in addition to providing much-needed social stability, would also, not incidentally, be useful to the public and private creditors who exercised an outsized influence during the convention. The word revolution literally means cycle, and to a large extent that captures what does in fact happen. At the beginning of the cycle, the corruption, injustice, and dysfunction of the old regime grow until they become unbearable. Then, moderates take control of a provisional government and begin the work of remediating those wrongs. But when a civil war breaks out between the partisans of the old regime and the partisans of the revolution, power moves from a moderate faction to a radical one, which saves the revolution by means of violence. Finally, a reversal takes place. The radicals are purged from power, the old abuses return, and the lawless situation culminates with the rise of a tyrant. Although superficially revolutions see a return to their point of departure, this does not mean revolutions are futile. Generally speaking, revolutions replace incompetent leaders and open positions of institutional authority to talented members from all classes. Government bureaucracy is streamlined, and many cultural changes that occur during a revolution remain in place for a long time after. And while it's generally true that revolutions do not immediately produce a decisive transformation in the distribution of social power, when transformations of that type gradually come in the subsequent decades and centuries, they come invariably as the crown of a flower whose seeds were planted during the revolution itself. One interesting commonality that is often overlooked in the sociology of revolutions is the centrality of the family. Pretty much all revolutions show symptoms of a wide range of sexual pathologies and dysfunctions during their prodromal phase. When in power, revolutionaries invariably spend a great deal of time and energy enacting marriage reforms and policing sexual propriety. And in almost every case, revolutionary periods conclude not with the remediation of economic injustices, which are often as bad or worse after as before a revolution, but when the period of sexual license that precedes it comes to a decisive end, at least in formal law. Both Napoleon and Stalin, for example, strengthened marriage law and made divorce harder. Stalin outlawed abortion, and in the 1930s, in a radical departure from the teachings of Engels, the Communist Party began propagandizing on behalf of the family. In Rome, after the assassination of Julius Caesar and the civil war that followed, Emperor Augustus also strengthened the institution of marriage by outlawing class exogamy and placing various penalties on unmarried persons. A long time ago, Aristotle observed that revolutions occur when members of a political community perceive arbitrary inequality between their wealth and honors. This makes the fact that revolutions so frequently conclude not with the creation of equality, but with the strengthening of the institution of marriage unexpected and somewhat odd. At a glance, it would seem there is some relationship between the perception of inequality and conflict on the one hand, and sexual permissiveness on the other, but very few political philosophers have made any serious effort to elucidate it. It's true that one finds scattered remarks here and there connecting politics to morality and morality to family, but often these remarks are theoretically hazy, and what attempts at sophistication are made, as for example by Freud in the psychoanalytic school, generally produce confusion more commonly than clarity. To sort all this out, in my view, would take nothing less than a revolution in political thought. And who knows whether a revolution in ideas might not someday produce a corresponding revolution in deeds.